In 1914, Europe's major powers were divided into two rival teams. On one side was the Triple Entente, which included France, Britain, and Russia. They were all united because they were afraid and suspicious of Germany, which had become Europe's new strongest power. On the other side was the Triple Alliance. This included Germany, which was scared of being surrounded by its enemies, Austria-Hungary, which was trying to hold its fragile empire together, and Italy, which hoped to gain land from France. The event that lit the fuse happened on June 28th in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man next in line to rule the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was killed by a 19-year-old Slav nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Austro-Hungary blamed its rival, Serbia, for helping with the assassination. They sent Serbia a list of very tough demands. When Serbia refused, Austro-Hungary declared war. Just hours later, Austrian cannons were firing on Belgrade. Russia's leader, Tsar Nicholas II, felt he had a duty to protect Serbia, since they were both Slav nations, so he ordered his army to get ready for war. Germany's leader, Wilhelm II, had already promised to support Austro-Hungary. He and his generals believed a war with Russia was going to happen sooner or later, and it was better to fight now before Russia got any stronger. So when Russia started getting its army ready, Germany used it as an excuse to do the same and then declared war on Russia. Germany knew that a war with Russia also meant a war with Russia's ally, France. To handle fighting a war on two sides at once, they came up with the Schlieffen Plan. First, their armies would move quickly through neutral Belgium to surround and defeat the French armies near Paris for a fast victory. Then, they could move their soldiers east to fight Russia, because its huge army would take much longer to get ready. And with that, Germany declared war on France. 6 million men were now marching to war across Europe. Italy, however, decided to stay neutral. The rules of the Triple Alliance didn't force it to join a war that its allies started. The United States also declared it would stay neutral. President Wilson and the American public had no wish to get mixed up in Europe's war. Britain was an ally of France, but at first, it wasn't certain if it would join the fight. But when German troops invaded Belgium, a country Britain had promised to protect, a final warning was sent from London to Berlin telling them to leave. It was ignored, and Britain declared war. A British army force landed in France. The German invasion was held up for several very important days by the Belgians, who fought back hard at the fortress city of Liège. German soldiers killed many Belgian civilians in several attacks. Stories about these terrible acts were exaggerated by the Allies, which helped turn other neutral countries against Germany. France, not knowing about Germany's big plan to surround them, launched its own attack into German land, called Plan 17. But in a big battle, they were pushed back with huge losses on both sides. The British force fought the German army at Mons, but the British had far fewer soldiers and soon had to retreat with the French. The Allies took a stand at the River Marne, just 40 miles from Paris. Their desperate counterattack saved the city and pushed the Germans back. Both sides lost about 250,000 soldiers. A race to the sea started, as both sides tried to get around the other's army by moving north. A series of fights led to the First Battle of Ypres, where the Allies just barely managed to hold on and stop the Germans from breaking through their lines. Again, there were heavy losses on both sides. The two armies then dug deep trenches all along the 350-mile front line to hide from deadly machine gun fire and artillery bombs. Trench warfare had begun. British warships won the first sea battle of the war, sinking 3 German cruisers. Britain had the most powerful navy in the world, with 29 modern battleships to Germany's 19. They used their ships to create a naval blockade around Germany, stopping all goods, including food, from getting in by sea. The plan was to wreck Germany's economy and force it to give up. But a week later, a British ship became the first in history to be sunk by a deadly new weapon, a torpedo fired from a submarine. German submarines, or U-boats, could travel for thousands of miles and attack without being seen from under the water. They were a dangerous new threat to Britain's control of the seas. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies invaded a part of Germany called East Prussia, but they made a huge mistake and suffered a terrible defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg. A German general, von Hindenburg, and his chief of staff, Ludendorff, planned a brilliant victory. They captured 90,000 prisoners and destroyed an entire Russian army. The Russians helped cause their own defeat by sending radio messages that weren't in code. Another huge German victory at Masurian Lakes forced the Russians to retreat. In just 6 weeks, the Russian army lost nearly 1/3 men. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungary's invasion of Serbia ended in a shameful defeat at the Battle of Sayre. Austro-Hungary's attack on Russia also turned into a disaster, forcing a retreat with over 300,000 men lost. The fortress town of Przemysl was surrounded by the Russians. The Germans had to come and help by launching an attack towards Warsaw to draw Russian soldiers away. This led to weeks of terrible winter fighting, but neither side won. At the same time, the Turkish Ottoman Empire joined Germany's side and declared war on its old enemy, Russia. Turkish warships bombed Russian ports, while Russian soldiers crossed into Turkey. Away from Europe, the war was also being fought on the world's oceans and in faraway European colonies. German soldiers crossed into British East Africa, now Kenya, and took over a town. Allied soldiers took control of the German colony of Togoland, now Togo. But British soldiers invading German Cameroon were defeated in battle, and a force of 3,000 men attacking German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, was captured. A month later, a British landing at Tonga ended in a total failure, beaten by a much smaller German force led by Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck. Cut off from Germany, he went on to fight a very successful hit-and-run war against the Allies, keeping many of their soldiers busy. In Asia, Japan kept its promise to Britain and declared war on Germany. Japanese soldiers then took over the German naval base at Tsingtao. The German colonies of Samoa and New Guinea surrendered to soldiers from New Zealand and Australia. But in the Pacific Ocean, a powerful German squadron of ships led by Admiral von Spee sank 2 British cruisers. Everyone on board was lost. 5 weeks later, he came across a larger British naval force at the Falkland Islands. 4 of his 5 German ships were sunk, and von Spee went down with his main ship. At the same time, in the Middle East, British soldiers took control of the port of Basra, which gave them access to the Persian oil they needed for their fleet. That winter, Austrian soldiers finally captured Belgrade. But then the Serbs counterattacked and pushed them back out again. The fighting in Serbia had already led to about 200,000 men being killed or wounded on each side. In the North Sea, German warships made a quick surprise attack on English coastal towns, bombing Hartlepool, Whitby, and Scarborough, and killing more than 100 civilians. On the Western Front, the French launched their first big attack on the German lines. But they only gained a small amount of ground and lost 90,000 men. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, a Turkish attack through the mountains in the middle of winter ended in disaster. The Turks lost 60,000 soldiers, with many of them freezing to death. On the Western Front that first Christmas, soldiers in some areas had a short truce and even played football in no man's land, the deadly area between the trenches.